Hello and welcome to the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum's celebration of Constitution Day 2021. Today's presenter will be Thomas Hogle. Dr. Hogle is a professor of social science at SUNY Morrisville, located in Morrisville, New York. Dr. Hogle has a bachelor's from SUNY Oswego, a master's from SUNY Plattsburgh, and a Ph.D. from the University of Colorado. Dr. Hogle served in the United States Army from 1966 through 1969, in which he was in the Mekong Delta, Vietnam from 1967 through 1968 in the 9th Infantry Division, and where he received the Combat Infantry Badge. Dr. Hogle was born in Washington, D.C., where his parents met in the Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., while taking care of General John J. Pershing, who served in the American Expeditionary Forces. Dr. Hogle is the oldest of 12 children and was raised in Syracuse and Manoa, New York. I'd like to now invite Dr. Hogle to begin his presentation for Constitution Day.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we'd like to make a presentation for Constitution Day, and we're going to make our subject specifically the 13th Amendment. Now, I'd like to offer a prologue before we talk about the Constitution, and make the point that when the first English colonies were formed in the 1700s, 1607 at Jamestown and 1620 with the Pilgrims, there was no slavery among the English. It was introduced in the 17th century by the Portuguese and specifically by the Dutch. And the first African Americans landed in an English colony was Jamestown in 1619. Now, by the 18th century, slavery was apparent and viable in all 13 of the English provinces. There were slave codes or black codes had been enforced, which said that that the children of slave women were slaves, and that slavery was based on race, and that it was permanent, and the children were permanent. At the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there were approximately 400 to 800,000 slaves in the 13 American states. It was in the written Constitution. There was a fugitive slave code. Slave hunters could come up to other states and find runaway slaves, and under the Constitution, you were supposed to render assistance to these fellow Americans looking for their property, which slaves were chattel property. There is no reference to the word slaves in the Constitution. They use the reference persons held to labor. So persons held to labor. Now, the rules for the convention were that the Constitution needed 9 states to ratify. Since neither Rhode Island nor North Carolina sent representatives, that meant that we were down to 11 states, and we needed 9 of them. And there were a couple of near misses. The Great Compromise was a compromise between big states and little states. It said that the membership of the House of Representatives would be based on size of population, which favored the big states. Yet each state would be given 2 senators, which meant that the small states were equal to the big states, and no legislation could become law unless it passed the exact same wording in both the House and Senate. As for representation in the House of Representatives, the slave states, which at the time there were 6 of them, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. I think I've got them all there. The point was that the slave states wanted to be able to count their slaves for the purposes population when determining the number of members of the House of Representatives. I always give the example, fictional, of South Carolina. If South Carolina had 100,000 white citizens and 100,000 slaves, they wished 3/5 of the slaves to be counted for population. In their case, if you said 20,000 people equaled one member of the House of Representatives, you would have 5 seats based on the white population, and then you would have the 3/5ths rule. So the 100,000 would be an extra 3 members of the House based on slaves, which were considered chattel slavery. Now, many Northerners, where slavery was dying out, it wasn't as economically efficient, they did not like this. They thought it was an artificial way to pump up the Southern states' power in the House of Representatives. And plus, the president was going to be chosen by electoral ballots, and electoral ballots were going to equal the number of members of the House plus the 2 senators. So it would literally increase their power to elect presidents and to pass legislation. On the other hand, the Southern states, led by Georgia and South Carolina, were adamant. They would not ratify. So that would have been 6 out of the 11. You don't have 9. You don't have the ratification vote necessary. So quite literally, the Constitution hung on a compromise, and it's called the 3/5 compromise. What the Northern states did exact is an end to the international slave trade at the end of 1807. They would be 20 years of allowed international slave trade, then it would end. Now, at the time, most Southerners were embarrassed, if you will, over what they called their peculiar institution. And they made the defense that they needed these slaves, that it was a necessary evil. They needed to bring in their tobacco. They needed to bring in their wheat crops. They needed this labor to work their plantations in order to provide for their families. And that the necessary evil they certainly hoped would go away. And that's where things stood in the 18th century. Now, what happens is after the United States is formed and with a new constitution in 1788, when the 9th state, New Hampshire, ratified, we eventually had a Bill of Rights added, and we had North Carolina and Rhode Island enter the Union. But we also had an economic earthquake. It was called the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution began in England, and it was based on an improvement of the steam engine. England has many rivers. It has lots of coal, so it had water to heat and coal to heat it with. And the pressure of the steam would make turbines go around. And it was power other than animal and human power, which mankind had depended on for most of its existence, with the exception of some windmills. But the mass production of textiles made cotton very important. Wool, when it is wet, does not retain heat. Cotton does, and it can dry and evaporate and let perspiration evaporate. So the problem was for cotton in the early days that there were too many seeds and it was too hard to gin them, if you will. But Eli Whitney, a Rhode Islander, visiting Nathaniel Greene's widow's plantation in South Carolina, came up with a way to put thin bands of metal through which seeds could not go through. And all of a sudden, one slave could gin, if you will, 5, 6, 7, 10 times the amount of cotton that they could before. And the patent laws were so weak that a screw changed here or a turntable here could be called a different machine. So we have the widespread use of the cotton engine. We have growing world dependence on cotton from the United States. During the 8-year blockade, when we did not trade with Great Britain, between 1807 and 1815, New England began to produce its own textile mills, and cotton just grew and grew and grew. By the 1850s, the cotton crop was the biggest export crop of the United States and the major source of our economic funding. And cotton now was not considered, slavery was no longer considered a necessary evil, but now it's defended as a positive good. The best state for African Americans is in a slave plantation where needs can be taken care of. When they're sick, they don't have to go to work, where their children are raised and taken care of by a good Christian mistress and master. That was the defense of slavery as a positive good, and it's one that the South increasingly clings to and will not leave. What we have is the first major political crisis is Missouri. In 1787, the Continental Congress had passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and it said there could be no slavery above the Ohio River. And it was passed before there was a constitution or a president or anything else. The Land Ordinance of 1787. Well, Missouri is Missouri is above the Ohio River. And there was an immediately complaint by a New York representative and James Talmadge, and the South said, we will not back down. Missouri must come in as a slave state. And there were hot words being flown in both sections, the North and the South. Now, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, came up with a timely compromise. Maine territory had been run by Massachusetts, also wanted to enter the Union. And so the compromise was that Missouri would come in as a slave state and Maine would come in as a free state. It kept its free and slave states equal at 11 apiece. The South being well aware they will never win a vote in the House of Representatives because most European immigrants don't want to go to a section where the hard physical labor is done by slaves. Yet in the Senate, they are equal to the North, and they can always block any unfriendly legislation. That compromise gave the United States over 30 years of peace. Now, the problem is, under the Missouri Compromise, there was only a little land below the southern boundary of Missouri open to slavery. It's eventually going to be settled and called the state of Arkansas. The problem is, in 1846, we went to war with Mexico. We defeated them soundly by 1848, and the Mexican cession left hundreds of thousands of acres of formerly Spanish, then Mexican territory. What is to be done with these territories? And a compromise of sorts comes up with the KansasNebraska Act. And the idea is that you vote. The territorial members who move into that territory can vote when they apply for statehood, whether they want slavery or they don't want slavery. It led to outright violence in Kansas, bleeding Kansas. It made the issue a front burner again. Even after an attempt at a compromise in 1850, which allowed California to come in as a free state, but it also allowed Southerners to go into the North, and with another Fugitive Slave Act. In 1860, the Democratic Party tore itself apart, and we had two candidates, a Southern Democratic candidate and a Northern Democratic candidate, Stephen A. Douglas. The Republicans unified behind Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. He won. He wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states, but he won enough of the vote of the North to be elected president. This was too much for the South. The first Southern state to secede was South Carolina, eventually joined by 6 other deep Southern states. It was always about slavery. They called it states' rights, but it was a states' rights to maintain slavery. Now, when Abraham Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861, he said the decision of civil war was not in his hands, but in the Southern's hands. And he tries to reinforce Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. the new Confederate President Jefferson Davis orders Sumter to be fired on, and by April of 1861, we have Civil War. Now, during the early enlistment and the early battles, Black troops were not sought or allowed to be enlisted in the Union Army. By 1863, President Lincoln realizes he needs what he calls his sable arm. He needs the slaves to be, or African American slaver free, to be a part of the Union forces. And he suggests that he will issue an Emancipation Proclamation saying that all slaves in Southern states will henceforth be free. He is cautioned by his Secretary of State to wait for a victory. In September of 1862, he gets that victory at the Battle of Antietam, and he puts out a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was made permanent on January 1st, 1863. All slaves in Southern control are now free. Now, it doesn't free anybody because the South is not going to let them go, but it does mean every time the Union Army gets close, waves of Southern Black slaves flee to the Union lines, and soldiers are enlisted in the Union Army, Black troops. The South calls it slave insurrection, and there are episodes where surrendering Blacks are killed, white officers also. It means there will be no substitution, there will be no trading of prisoners after 1863, and it leads to horrendous numbers of death and disease in both the North and the South. Now, Lincoln knows that it's a war measure. His Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves, but he's president, it's a war. He needs a permanent solution. He needs an amendment to the Constitution. And so he puts all his political pressure and that of his party, the Republican Party, and they need to make an amendment to the Constitution that ends slavery in the United States. It's rather ironic because in 1861, there was a compromise 13th Amendment, which would have put into the Constitution that slavery will forever be legal in the United States. It was an attempt to avert civil war. It was never passed. The South had already determined to leave. So now we have the next amendment, the 13th Amendment, and it is introduced in January of 1865. And I have the wording right here. And it says, Amendment 13, December 18th, 1865, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereupon the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Folks, it passes. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. It is ratified in December of 1865, but the loophole that there can be no enslavement unless found guilty in a court of law. That is the loophole. What Southern states proceed to do in the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century is they pass specious black codes. And you can be, if you do not have a job by the beginning of January, end of January of a year, you can be auctioned off and you have to go to the highest bidder. You can be found guilty of vagrancy, put in jail, and then you can be leased to factories, leased to farmers. You can do road work. You can work on a chain gang. It leads to hundreds of thousands of blacks being brutally treated, underfed, and dying of malnutrition. Famous movies about I Escaped from a Chain Gang are based on reality in the 1920s and 30s. And it is an important way around the 13th Amendment. Now, let me say this. There is currently a movement to revise the 13th Amendment to get rid of that no enslavement unless you are found guilty in a court of law. Let me just say this. All the research I have done over the years, you do not revise amendments to the Constitution. You offer another amendment. If you take a look at the 18th Amendment for Prohibition, it wasn't revised, it was removed and replaced in the 1930s. So There is this big opening, big enough to drive a truck through it. We do still have the threat of work gangs when you are convicted of a crime, but I just must caution that you cannot revise the 13th Amendment. You must replace it if you will, and that would mean 3/4 of the states would have to ratify what 2/3 of the House and Senate have passed. A new 13th, in this case, would have to be the 28th Amendment, because the 27th is the last and most recent. Folks, I offer you this, that the 14th Amendment says that all citizens have certain rights and privileges, and that cannot be denied except by law. And under this protection, I believe that we can strengthen the 13th Amendment. I must tell you that the 13th Amendment solidifies the end of slavery. No one can come back and turn and say that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war act by a war president and it was temporary. We have an amendment to the Constitution, and it has ended slavery. There have been abuses of this. There probably could be abuses in the future. I'm not sure we need to revise it, but it does solve the problem of the Civil War. One, Southern youth cannot secede, and two, there is no longer chattel slavery in the United States of America. And I wish you a very good Constitution Day, and I'll say good night.
I'd like to thank Dr. Hogle for that wonderful presentation for Constitution Day. If you'd like to learn more about our educational programming, please check us out at www.nationalabolitionhalloffamandmuseum.org. Additionally, you can always view our digital programs at the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum YouTube channel. Both of the links are available on your screen. Thank you.